Hello, and welcome to the COP30 newsroom here at High House, live from the Green Zone in Belém. Every morning, we're bringing you behind the scenes on the biggest stories of the day with a selection of the best climate journalists in the world. On today's show, I'm delighted to be joined by Megan Rowling, the editor of Climate Home News, Ryan Bachu from CNC3 in Trinidad and Tobago, who is returning to the panel today, and Caroline O'Doherty, climate and science correspondent at the Irish Times. Thanks all very much for joining us. Let's get started with the first story of the day. Story from AFP, and the headline is "The world will suffer without fossil fuels," says Russia's COP30 negotiator. Now, you might think Russia would say that; they're the fifth largest emitter in the world. But looking at the interview, the point that they're trying to make is about the energy mix around the world, and that fossil fuels does have to be a part of the energy mix. Megan, what's your take on the interview?
I think that you would expect Russia to say something like that. I mean, obviously, they sell a lot of oil, well, obviously they're under sanctions at the moment, but, they have huge amounts of fossil fuels to sell, and it's not in their interest to say we should be transitioning away from fossil fuels anytime soon. But, I think what they're trying to express in this interview is the idea that countries that are poor basically need to have access to all the energy sources that they can in order to be able to develop. He mentions Brazil. I think he says it's all right for countries like France to be able to ditch fossil fuels. France has a lot of nuclear power, for example, but it's not so easy for countries, that don't necessarily have the money to invest up front in renewables. And I think that was the point he was trying to make, which may or may not apply to Russia.
And Ryan, the other point that they were making was that developed nations aren't doing enough to finance that transition in the developing nations. What's your view on that?
I think the crux of this entire interview surrounds that point. It's definitely about the emissions, but I think his real point is that yes, we have a transition underway. No, it's not happening fast enough. And absolutely no, it's not working for developing nations. And yes, developing nations have been promised and pledged a lot of things from developed nations that haven't been, quite frankly, met. And that's where we really need to look at. We're in the Amazon, where there have been protests all week. There'll be another major protest this morning for much of the very same reasons that we're talking about. And so I think this interview was a very good interview in the sense that it finally casts some light on developed nations holding themselves accountable, particularly the largest emitters of the world, to not only emissions, but the promises that have been made to developed nations that have been consistently broken. And I think this interview, if nothing else, really sheds some light on the challenges that the Amazon people have gone through, but also developing nations continue as it pertains to this energy transition.
Now, promises broken, is that a failure of the COP process, do you think, Caroline, or a failure more widely of the international order?
I think it's the international order. I mean, every country is country first. America says America first, but actually every country does the same. I think what's interesting about the tone of this interview, it's a narrative that's out there a lot that, fossil fuels saved us from, being cavemen all our lives, and without fossil fuels, you will suffer. And of course, there's a point to that. But, it has echoes of last year in Azerbaijan when the president said, fossil fuels are a gift from God, always presenting fossil fuels in a positive light. So yes, he has a point. And of course, and it's easy to pick the extreme cases. He's talked about, it's okay for you guys, but what about people in Siberia? We can't rely on solar. Do you know, actually they could, because solar isn't just about sun, it's about light, and the light will actually reflect off the snow. There is technology on the way. But, it's just, I think, yes, he has a point, but there is that thing, fossil fuels are fundamentally good because they saved us from, a dreadful existence, and that has to go.
In a way, and I'm sorry to cut you in, Richard, but in a way, there is this silent admission that the top five blocks and countries that are emitters, the United States, China, Russia, India, and the European Union, have themselves, as you've made that excellent point, have themselves not really been willing, have had the political will to transition. The technology is the best that it's been in the world for centuries, and yet they haven't been able to leverage that technology for their own purposes.
And that brings us very nicely onto the story that you've brought, Ryan, today. The story from the IEA, from Reuters referring to the IEA a couple of days ago. World oil and gas demand could grow until 2050. Now, that's something that we should be concerned about, right? That's a departure from previous reports.
I'm concerned about two things on the International Energy Agency. I've been following the International Energy Agency as an energy transition reporter for quite a while. And this report is vastly different from reports under the Biden administration. And it was almost concerning to me reading the report, because under the Biden administration, we would have seen this focus on greater, cleaner energy. We would have seen that we should have peaked with oil demand this decade. And now we're seeing that it's going to grow. Oil and gas demand is going to grow until 2050. So that's the first thing. I was a little bit concerned about how the IE, now obviously it's heavily funded by the United States, and it swings like a pendulum when it comes to these reports. However, I think there are some really good things in that report, particularly for some countries and small island states like those in the regional bloc of the Caribbean, Suriname, Guyana, where I live in Trinidad and Tobago, because now it's showing that there's this growing demand for fossil fuels, and this is me sort of taking off my climate change cap. If you're an oil and gas-based economy, and you're reading that IEA report that there's going to be a growing demand until 2050 for fossil fuels, you're saying, well, great. I can now plan for the next 25 years of supply to grow and build my economy and my people. So I think, and even liquefied natural gas is set to have like a 50% increase in the next 5 years. So it's a very interesting report for oil and gas-based economies, particularly developing nations that are oil and gas-based, but also there are some pretty decent things in there for fossil fuels and renewables, renewables, and the renewables industry over the next 10 years.
But in a way, you say it's effectively enabling countries to justify increased use of fossil fuels. Megan, what's your
not effectively, I think it is.
I think that report had different scenarios in it, basically, and the one scenario that was very pessimistic, which I assume is this one. I haven't read the Reuters story. So I think also they had this scenario which was basically called current policies, which is, what would happen if we just carried on with what we're doing today. And it's no doubt under that scenario that you would see oil and gas demand growing for that far into the future. But there are other scenarios, such as one called stated policies, which is what would happen if countries actually implemented the policies that they have on paper, and that is not as pessimistic an outcome. And I think in under that scenario, you would see oil and gas demand peaking way before. And so I think at the moment, and I understood that, the US has put pressure on the International Energy Agency to come out with this kind of more pessimistic forecast, because it's very important for fossil fuel producers to be able to pick up on something and say, well, we can justify production because we know that demand is going to continue. That very much depends on what governments do in the next 10 years. So I think it's all rather kind of speculative, and I wouldn't say that that was going to be necessarily the case. It depends, on things that get decided at COPs, and, the cost of renewables is falling massively, and most new demand for power is being met by renewables. So we don't have to stick with this.
Yeah. Caroline?
Yeah, there is a concern, though, about immediate demands of AI, because the Global Carbon Budget report this week does predict that US emissions will increase because of the AI effect. So, and they're not being met immediately by renewables, and yet the demand for AI growth is immediate. So maybe not all the way out to 2050 we might see growth, but I do think I think there's something in that report. I don't think we can dismiss it, because even in Ireland, we have a growing data center industry. We have a demand for AI. We have national policy that wants to attract AI. We do not have the renewable electricity to supply that.
Sorry, if I can just add one thing. Carolyn made an interesting point. Megan made an interesting point. I always like to respond to this when I hear it, that the cost of renewables are tanking. That's true. But that's not true for many developing countries. That's not true for the Caribbean. It remains incredibly expensive. In fact, it's cheaper for my people to use electricity than it is to invest in solar. It's not true across the board, but the global north countries are doing fantastic with renewables.
Well, let's move on to a story that is around that, so funding from global north countries. Megan, you've brought this story on adaptation. You've been following it for a long time. Adaptation's often been seen as a slightly poor relation at COPs. Why is it becoming more important here at COP30?
It's becoming more important because of what's happening around us in the world. Climate change impacts are affecting pretty much everybody. I live in Spain, I live in Barcelona. The summers are becoming pretty much unbearable. The temperatures, extreme temperatures in the summer, especially at night, making it really, really difficult to sleep. We've seen Hurricane Melissa barreling through the Caribbean just a couple of weeks ago, causing billions of dollars worth of destruction. We saw a huge typhoon hitting the Philippines just as we started COP. And, there are droughts, there are floods, and wildfires are becoming, a major problem. And it's not just in the developing world. It's not just in the global south. It's hitting Europe, it's hitting the US. And I think there's pretty much nobody these days who can say that they're not affected in some way by climate change impacts. I mean, obviously, some people are struggling much more than others. Now, one of the reasons for that, apart from the ferocity of the impacts, is what is my ability to cope, right? So, it's too hot for me to sleep at night, but can I afford to buy air conditioning or not? So, these are decisions that people are having to make in their daily lives. For example, it could be a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa who's planted the same crops at the same time of year their whole lives, but now the weather patterns are changing. Or droughts are becoming, longer and fiercer, and they're struggling to do that. But, have they got the money to invest in trying to find new crops or change the way that they work? And the problem is that, in many cases, people just don't have the ability to pay for the measures that we know can be taken to actually help people cope with climate change in their everyday lives. And, taking that up to the global level is the same. And the demand here is that the countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis over the course of history since the Industrial Revolution should be providing money to help those who don't have the means to take these measures to enable their people to adapt. But that money has not been forthcoming.
So specifically, money for adaptation has been less forthcoming than other things like mitigation. Caroline, I mean, why is that?
Well, with mitigation, there's a chance you might make a commercial return because you can invest in renewables in another country's green transition, green energy transition. There's potential to bring, private investment behind that and actually make a buck out of it. Adaptation is what they would have seen as sort of dead money. As you say, irrigation or flood defense or, changing farming, and that can only benefits the people in that country. So there's a self-interest there, but I think you're right. It is adaptation is becoming more familiar to people and governments in developed countries. Ireland at the minute is in the clutches of Storm Claudia, and there's been blackouts and so on. And it's the second major storm where our electricity system has really suffered. That's a developed country. And now we're suddenly realizing it's not just about storm repairs anymore, it's about adaptation. They're now talking about, well, we're going to have to change our electricity system so that it can cope. The difficulty there is, while that means that adaptation now becomes part of the parlance in the governments of developed worlds, they're talking about financing. They think, well, we need the funding for our country, so what's left for developed countries? But I think they do understand that there is that link between, if you can't help certain countries adapt to what they're coping with, you do end up with a country in turmoil, and you do end up with conflict, and you do end up with migration, climate migration. So if they can make those links, that's, I think it's just a better understanding of what adaptation is and why it's essential.
And sort of plugging it into the wider geopolitical matrix. Ryan, obviously you're from Trinidad and Tobago. The Caribbean's been hit by some tremendous climate shocks only this month. What's your view on this story?
I think the real challenge with adaptation is how slow adaptation has moved at COPs and internationally over the last 5 years, perhaps even 10 years. And we've gotten to a point now in the Caribbean where we can no longer adapt our way out of climate change. Every year, last year, there was an incredibly disastrous storm called Beryl came very early in the hurricane season. This year, at the tail end of the hurricane season, it was Hurricane Melissa. My point is that the weather is changing so rapidly. By the time we're adapting to last year or the year before, the weather has astronomically changed and we're now forced to adapt. We're not moving fast enough. And because we're not moving fast enough, we're in small islands are losing ground faster than anywhere else. How do you tell an island in the Pacific that's experiencing 3 millimeters of sea level rise per year to adapt? Eventually, the water is going to submerge that island.
Richard, yeah, so I just wanted to kind of go back a little bit to this headline. It's what's being discussed here basically is what's called a global goal on adaptation, which is actually in the Paris Agreement. And it's taken 10 years to get to the stage where countries are actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of working out how do they measure progress on adaptation. And your point is absolutely key. It is very late. We should have been doing this way before. And now we're still having, you know, arcane discussions about adaptation indicators and how we measure progress when we should have just been making a lot more progress up to now. But this is all about finance again. So the reason why the African countries are saying, oh no, let's take more time to discuss this indicators is because they want to make sure that that includes a lot more finance, and developed countries are pushing back on that, and that's why we're seeing this kind of delays.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's move on to another story that the production team noticed this morning. It's a story in Bloomberg. Climate talks turn to risks of extracting critical minerals. Now, we've spoken a lot about energy and the energy transition. What we haven't spoken about are the extraction processes when it comes to critical minerals like lithium and cobalt. Megan, this is a really important issue at this COP, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually for the first time. So it is very much worth discussing here today, because yesterday draft text came out, which will be the basis for negotiations for what's called the Just Transition Work Programme, which is like, how do you do the energy transition in a way that doesn't leave people behind, that's fair, and that's sustainable. And obviously, something that we're going to need if we are going to do this transition is these critical minerals in much higher quantities. You know, we're talking exponentially more. The problem is that mining
by 2040,
exactly. Right? What's happened, you know, in the past is that mining has very much been something that's been accompanied by human rights abuses, environmental pollution, and, you know, if we're going to do things differently, if you talk to people about electric vehicles, they say, oh, yes, but you know that those vehicles do a lot of damage to people and the environment. This is about changing that so that the minerals that are needed are extracted from the ground in a much fairer and more socially responsible way. And developing countries and civil society groups have wanted to get that on the agenda here, and it is on the agenda here, but we don't know for sure, you know, whether it's going to stay in the text, but it's a big step forward.
And Caroline, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I just want a solution that doesn't cause a problem. And, you know, there is a potential problem. Yeah, there is a potential problem if we don't get this right. And you're right, it does kind of undermine public kind of views on the transition. Oh, look, it's not all green and perfect. No one has ever said it's perfect. So we do need to be, the human rights side of this is going to be absolutely critical. And the thing is, there are many developed countries. Ireland, again, has lithium deposits, and suddenly people are realizing, whoa, what are they going to dig in that lovely area? So there's this kind of awareness that this impacts upon developed countries too. You need to kind of grab that understanding, that something's going to happen under my feet, and here's the reasons why, and try and expand it to, well, developing countries have been dealing with extractive industries for years. So let's have a look at them too, and just bring it across the board. Let the world be in on this together. I don't know how you do that, but it's fundamental that it be got as right as possible. And there are going to be people unhappy with these critical minerals mining. Absolutely, there are people going to be hurt by it. It has to be done as just as possible.
Right.
I must be honest with you. The IEA report might have given us a forecast until 2050. I actually don't think that's going to be the biggest story in the next 25 years. I think these minerals are going to be a huge story. We've talked about the extractive industries. We've talked about the human rights. I'm going to talk about the geopolitical situation. Al Jazeera had an exclusive story yesterday with China and how they've really now put the stops on how they export, really their barricades on how they export minerals. That's going to be the biggest story in the next 25 years. That battle, geopolitically, is going to get nasty and it's going to get very, very intense. And I think that's a big story that we have to look out for. I think the way the minerals are shared around the world and exported, I think it's going to create real geopolitical tensions, the likes we've never seen before.
So as fossil fuels have created geopolitical tensions in the 20th century, perhaps these minerals will do the same in the 21st.
I don't see how it won't, because it's so badly needed, but it's not in every global north country. It's not in every global south country, you know? So I think it's going to create real issues that you have to keep your eyes on.
Totally agree. The world has woken up to the fact that China produces a lot of these and actually processes the vast majority of critical minerals. And all of a sudden, governments in the US and also in Europe have realized that, you know, given the geopolitical situation, it's a very high risk for them that they could, you know, China could just basically cut off you know, exports as it's already threatened to do on rare earths to the United States. And they're scrambling around to basically try and secure their own supplies in Europe. They've approved 47 strategic projects for critical minerals to be extracted in European countries. But now we're running into an issue in Europe, which is like people don't want that to happen in their backyard. And so communities are worried and they don't know what's happening exactly. And they're concerned that it's going to ruin their lovely countryside or their agriculture. But, you know, I think that we have to make the point that is it okay if that happens in the global south? And, you know, all of a sudden, it's when it's happening in your country, it's right in front of you. I think it will make people think much more about what happens in the global south as well, and that's a good thing.
And I do want to build on that point because sometimes we tend to talk about the incredible advancements of EVs and solar, etc., in global north countries, and we tout how great Norway is doing and how great Great Britain is doing without really understanding where those minerals and those extractive materials are coming from global south countries.
Exactly.
Let's stick with the geopolitics and move on to our last story. So this is a story that you wrote up in the Irish Times, Caroline. You were at an event yesterday with Al Gore. The headline, he's talking about Donald Trump. Let's not overreact. I think he made the point in there. You know, he's one of a number of American statesmen who have been sort of through COP this week. Yeah. Sheldon Whitehouse, Gavin Newsom, making headlines.
Yes.
And he made the point that 195 signatories to the Paris Agreement minus one doesn't equal zero. So maybe we shouldn't be too worried. But actually, Caroline, the point that you wanted to bring up was a bit lower down in the article, and was about reforming the COP process itself.
Exactly, and he mentioned, you know, issues that we've talked about for a long time, and he talked about the fossil fuel delegates, and I know you spoke about this here earlier in the week, you know, but he does have a point from a public perspective. Confidence in COP, confidence in climate leaders. When they hear that there are 1,600 fossil fuel delegates, and I know it's hard to define them, at an event like this, they get cynical, and cynical publics do not go with climate action. They do not vote for climate leaders in politics, okay? He also talked about the hosting. Obviously, we know we have a situation between Australia and Turkey, and they're both fighting over who's going to host COP. Again, from a public perspective, they're saying, why? What's in it for them? It can't be about climate. You know, is it about trade deals? Is it about, you know, energy projects? Why are they fighting? Again, you have to. So I don't know how you would do it. Maybe the UN, Simon Steele would take a name out of a hat. I don't know. And then he's talking about the decision-making process, and you know the fact that it's by consensus rather than majority voting, and that seems to have, you know, gone. But when you look back at it, there doesn't seem to have been a great discussion way back in the 90s about what was the best method. It sort of by default became consensus by default. How you would turn it into majority voting, I don't know. Would China, would it be one country, one vote? China, 1.4 billion people in San Marino with, you know, 30,000. Is that fair? I don't know. But he does. There are lots of issues, you know, around the COP process. Even the fact that we're still relying on the 1990s list of developed countries and developing nations, China's a developing nation. And that impacts then on finance and who gets what and who's responsible for what. We know about the size. COPs have just grown enormously. I know a lot of scientists, despair coming here because they feel that it's bloated. And yet I have this wonderful, idea. I really want there to be one scientist in every negotiating room, the same way you would have a legal advisor at a government cabinet table or in a corporate boardroom, so that when countries start saying, "Oh, we can't do that," a scientist goes, "Yes, but if you don't, this is what's going to happen." And there's just maybe one other thing, and there are so many fabulous organizations here, NGOs, climate justice bodies, the great expertise, and you kind of almost stumble upon the work that they've done for COP, these amazing reports. I stumbled upon Save Soil, have a fabulous one on the NDCs, and are they even looking at what's under our feet, the very foundations of our food production systems, our flood defenses, our carbon sinks. Carbon Brief had a great one on social media and climate disinformation, or information integrity, as COP is calling it, and how there are actually laws we could be applying, rather than saying, "Excuse me, please, Mr. Tech Bro, could you maybe address this issue? Here's a law we can apply." Could there be a wonderful COP library, compiled maybe a month, 2 months out from COP, where all the organizations who are going to be here can actually put up the reports? It gives you time to look at it. I don't expect COP to vet them all, but maybe they could just check that they're not pure propaganda pamphlets. It would also, again, back to the public. You can show public, here's the library, here's the work that's going on. Trust it, read it, understand that it is really widespread across the world, and it would just feed into that public confidence piece.
But there are still those symptoms of a system that doesn't seem to be quite working. We saw Azerbaijan was confirmed very late back in Dubai. We've got this row between Australia and Turkey now. I mean, they've confirmed COP32 before they've confirmed COP31. Megan, is the system fit for purpose, do you think?
I don't think that's the right question to ask, actually, because it immediately casts it in a negative light. And I think something that's very important for us as journalists to communicate is that, okay, the COP process, the UN climate process has not worked perfectly. It hasn't got us to where we need to be to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're not going to be able to do. But now the plan is, if we have to overshoot, we can still bring it back down. The point is that if we didn't have the Paris Agreement, we would be in a way worse position looking at global warming of, 4 degrees C or something like that. So it's not fair to say that it's not fit for purpose and it hasn't worked. It has worked. It just hasn't worked to the speed and the extent that we need it to work. So also, I think it's unfair to expect a process that's been going on for, the amount of time for decades to not be able to evolve, right? The world has changed quite a lot in that time. So I think it should be more about how can we make this process better able to support what needs to happen in the outside world. And that is what the Brazilians are talking about, that this needs to be a COP, not for making lots more new agreements, but that we need to actually implement what we've already agreed, especially back in Paris 10 years ago. And that's why the Brazilians are calling it a COP of implementation. It's how do you translate what's decided here to the outside? Of course, it can be made much more effective. And I think actually the UN climate body is already working on ideas for reforms and is consulting experts, and they're going to talk with countries about those potential reforms next year. So we definitely don't need to be hopeless about the state of play here. It can evolve, and it should.
Yeah, so it's imperfect, but it's the best we've got. Ryan, what's your...
It's the only thing we've got.
Yeah, it's essentially the best that we've got, and it does work. It does work. People are very, and rightfully so, they're very in a hurry to get this to get climate change under control, but it has worked. We're in a better position now than we were 10 years ago. We're in a better position now, than we were 5 years ago. But what I would say is that if it's one thing that I would change, and I know that the process of reforming COP is not going to be done in 1 year or 2 years. It's 190 plus countries you're dealing with, different personalities, different politicians. What I would say is that one of the things that I would really get rid of, hopefully, if I had the opportunity, would be the little bickering between text. I think it serves us no good. I think it takes too long. It draws out the process. Last year's COP went 36 hours over. That's one thing. I would sort of eliminate that if I could, and let's get to the point, and let's get to implementation.
speaking of sessions going over, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, today. So thanks very much for joining us here at High House in COP30. Thank you, too, for joining us watching at home. Goodbye for now.